call Dr. Peter Hamilton to the chair.
Over there.
Yeah.
I call this house to order and call on the pro-requisite secretary to read the minutes of the last public business meeting. So I'd like to start by introducing you to our esteemed guest, Trinity Ted. This was like entirely like my doing. I was asked to do this, and then I went over to Tom's office, and they were like, "Oh, no one knows who Trinity Ted is." So we'd be delighted to have you bring him along. He's a long-term friend of mine. Me and Trinity Ted go way back. If you guys don't know, that will illuminate exactly how successful public affairs and communications marketing department are at something they do. So he's a bit of a Trinity socialite, for whatever that means. If you've ever got any of those emails that you get sort of every week that tell you, oh, there's this talk on in this place that you sort of quickly delete and then go on to whatever else you're getting. Trinity Ted is at every single one of those. He's in fact the only person at every single one of those, and the only person at any of those. But in fact, I've been told that the public affairs and communications department have actually made 15 Trinity Teds just to fill the seats that are empty when the provost gives his address to the students. On one hand, he's lovable, he's cute, right? Yeah. But you know, once you get to know someone, you get to see their darker side. And you know, to be honest, I really live in the shadow of Ted. He's pretty big, so it's a big shadow. It's hard to be the friend of such a notorious public figure. You know, you will see him, you know, using his Bunsen burners on the Instagram page, or relaxing in the Edinburgh Theatre. Ted's everywhere by all accounts. But I would like to sort of expose a secret about Ted. I don't know if you guys haven't heard of the society TEDx. Now, everyone thinks that about public speaking society, but I will actually tell you that what they do is X-rated TED. You want to see this guy? You want to see this guy go bare naked 5 nights a week down on the business building? You can do that. You just sign up to that email list, and you'll they keep it fairly quiet. Obviously, Ted is a public persona that he wants to hide, and you know I get that. And you know maybe him or anyone who happens to be from in the audience will not be very happy with me saying that. But that is of course now out there, and I'm sorry to anyone who is involved with that. Thank you. Are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting? Then I shall duly sign. I should now like to call upon the auditor to introduce the invited guests to the house.
So, hello again. This is the part of the meeting where we actually have the debate. We're delighted to have two extremely good guest speakers at tonight's debate. Our first is our chair, Dr. Peter Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is a historian specializing in Chinese history. His research focuses primarily on 19th and 20th century transnational Chinese networks of trade and migration, with a particular interest in intersections between business and education. He is the author of The Network Economy, which re-examines Hong Kong's economic history during the Cold War through its trans-Pacific networks with the United States and its role in facilitating the revival of Sino-US trade in the 1970s. We have a proposition guest this evening, and his name is Craig McHugh, and he is the current VP for the Dublin region of the Union of Students in Ireland. McHugh has been an activist since his school days, having led the Irish Second Level Students' Union in 2014, where he focused on access to education and cutbacks. He has been politically active ever since, and in DCU, where he played a lead role in the Shanghai Shakedown, which ultimately led to the introduction of rent cap legislation for student accommodation at the college. He later became a sabbatical officer for the Students' Union in DCU, where he worked on student placement supports. And we're delighted to have him here with us this evening. Could we have a round of applause for our guests? Just before we begin, there are a couple of standing orders of how you can engage with the debate this evening, or how you can keep track of how basically how good the speakers were. The first point to note is that speeches are 7 minutes in length. During the end of the first minute and the start of the last minute, which are signaled by a bell, you can stand up and ask the speaker a question. That's called a point of information. So you can stand up and say, on that point, and then the speaker can either accept you or reject your point. If they do accept you, you can ask a question that's less than 15 seconds in length. That's basically it. We'd encourage engagement from the audience. Those are points of information. On your seats, you will also find oratory returns, which list slide speakers. They look like little pamphlets. You can rate using the guidelines provided and how good you thought the speakers were. These are really important because we give out prizes at the end of the year based on those ratings. So the best speaker is awarded €200 in cash, in addition to a very prestigious medal award prizes at the end of each year. So your ratings do very much matter. At the end of the debate, we'll collect them at the door on your way out. If you have been affected by any issues raised in the debate, our equity officers' contact details on the back of the oratory returns. So without further ado, I think to go back to the chair to start the debate.
The question before the House this evening is that this House believes that it is impossible to be apolitical, and I should now like to call upon Jack Sinnott to propose the motion to the House.
Politics, members of the House, is just a sexy word for human interaction. Members of the College Historical Society, throughout history, humankind has sought to end politics. We have sought a world without negotiation, without compromise, without struggle. This quest, noble in its execution, pure in its aims, has consistently failed. And over the next 7 minutes, I'm going to explain to you exactly why. I'm going to do a few things in the course of this opening government speech. Firstly, I will define politics in a way that can be used throughout this debate and get over any messy issues that might become caught up throughout the course of the debate. Then I'm going to talk to you about two concepts which I believe show us why all of life is political. I'm going to talk about complicity, and I'm going to talk about hierarchy. But the first thing to do is to define politics. I feel like often in our regular discourse, and probably in how the opposition are going to approach this debate, politics is used pejoratively. It's used to refer to backroom dealings by characters in the thick of it, and people in Machiavelli books and that kind of thing. And I think that is kind of a conception we have of politics as a sort of process that happens mainly in government but in other areas of life, and that is this kind of sticky sort of operational concept. And I don't think that is really what politics is. I think that is part of what politics is, and it's an expression of it, a very obvious, clear expression that we see a lot of the times. But I think really at its core, politics is systems of relations of power, how we operate within them and how they operate in our lives. I think it is reasonably fair to say that any interaction where power plays an important role is a political interaction. I think that's a roughly fair conception. I think it's a useful conception, because I think when you think of politics like that, that's the point at which you understand just the sheer importance of politics in how our world operates. And this kind of leads me to the two concepts I want to talk about in this speech. The first is the idea of complicity, of the role that we all play in the structures in our society, the role that we all play in the political world. And the kind of crux of my argument, I suppose, tonight is the idea that action is equal to non-action. I think it is very easy to say that you don't engage in any political acts, but even not doing things can be engaging in a political act. The fact that I don't actively choose to think about politics or to engage in political actions is kind of irrelevant to whether my life is political or whether I am political. And I think there are kind of two reasons for that. No, thank you. The first is that seemingly non-political actions can just have political consequences. Human beings don't live our lives in a vacuum. Everything we do impacts the world around us. My going to Trinity, a posh Protestant college which for a large part of its existence didn't allow the entrance of women or Catholics, and still to this day only allows a very privileged subset of the Irish community to attend, is a political action. My being a member of the Hist, a society that until 51 years ago also didn't allow women to attend, also didn't allow Catholics to attend, and is still to some extent a rather showboaty, rather privileged society, is also a political action. My using plastic, which is destroying the planet, my eating eggs which had to be taken from enslaved chickens, all of these things are political actions. And there are things that I do every single day, and there are things that everyone in this room does every single day. And I think that is the first reason why our lives are just intensely political. All of these small decisions that we make do have consequences for the larger world. And I think secondly, our aggregate actions of human society as a whole are just things that we as individuals simply can't escape. There are ways in which we are just caught up in networks of oppression, networks of domination, networks of power that we just can't get out. My being a white person, even if I decide that I want to dedicate my entire life to stopping racism, still the fact that I am white and that I benefit from the power systems of racism and that the existence of racism allows me to do better in my life means that I am complicit in this structure, means that my whiteness is a political act even if I fight against it. So even if you actively try to escape politics, you are still caught up within it by our very nature, by the very nature of the world that we live in, and by the very nature of society as a concept. So I think that is kind of the crux of why we can't escape politics, and really what that idea boils down to, what that system of the working of the world boils down to, is just the concept of hierarchy and the fact that we are always, at all times, situated within hierarchies and engaged in them and playing a role within them. I could list off so many systems of hierarchy I'm involved in my life. And these start at really minor power relations that I'm caught up in generally. There is a power relationship between my lecturer and me when my lecturer corrects my paper because their grade decides how I do in the module. There is a power relationship between me and other members of the Hist when I decide who speaks on a Wednesday night because speaking is fun and everyone wants to do it, but only 8 people can. There is power relations within offices, within college, everywhere we go, and this these small examples build up to the larger systems and hierarchies of privilege that we see in our society. Things like racism, things like classism, things like misogyny. And we are all always situated within these things, within this kind of nexus of power that we really can't escape. And even if you are reasonably low down on the hierarchy, you're still situated within it. It's still relevant to your life. Even if it doesn't help you, it is still a thing that exists in the structure of your life and can't be escaped. So I think that for that reason, no matter how much we want to escape politics, we really just can't, because they are a fact of our existence. And I'm on 6 minutes, so to kind of sum up, I sort of want to go back to what I was talking about in the definition of politics and the idea that politics might be pejorative. I don't think it is, but I think that in some circumstances, and in the best circumstances usually, it does imply a kind of responsibility. At its best, I think politics can function as a powerful medium for change, or a medium for achieving a better world. And I think that if we accept that our entire life is political, that we are implicated in the political and that we are living political lives every single day, I think that could be the first small step towards building a world that would actually be nice to live in, and not just for people who go to Trinity and are members of the Hist. I have never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
I would like to thank Harry for their fine speech and call upon Craig Hugh to continue the case.
Material.
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me today here in Trinity College Dublin. I suppose I'm going to get slagged a bit coming here for my DCU friends where I once went. That's a joke. I don't know how Trinity humour works yet. Essentially, I want to talk to you tonight about how in 2019 it is essentially impossible to be apolitical. Our very lives and the existential threats that we faced within them on this very day are shaped by and revolve around political events that we pretty much have a minimal impact on. Brexit, Trump, climate change, the housing crisis, the health crisis, the beef crisis. How does one escape politics and genuinely, in the truest form, be apolitical? It's essential when we look at this point that we understand the definition of apolitical and its difference from being non-partisan. For a lot of people tend to mix these things up. Not interested or involved in politics. That's the clear-cut definition of apolitical according to Google. Not biased or partisan, especially towards any particular political group. So there we have it. And remember, not biased or partisan means taking a particular ideological side in a debate. So remember, when we talk about apolitical, it means to literally have no interest in the political realities of the present day. It sounds pretty tough, doesn't it? Now then, there's also those of you who think, no, Donald Trump can do what he likes. Boris Johnson can turn into the worst form of the Hulk he likes. The climate can literally break down. But then we look closer to home. 2 major referenda with huge turnouts and an even bigger interest: marriage equality and repeal the 8th. Further to this, we should also look at the dangers of accepting apoliticism. There is obviously an inalienable right to choose to not vote when in a democracy, just as much so that you have the right to vote. And participation and non-participation are both forms of participation. But when we accept apoliticism as being in any way normalized, we are in a very dangerous place. So there we have the setting. Let's dig in a bit deeper. The world is literally on fire, both metaphorically and also literally. The United Kingdom has voted to leave the European Union, and with it has opened an entire can of worms not seen in British, Irish, or European politics in decades. It has laid bare the racism, xenophobia, and thirst for nationalism within the UK. It has exposed the divides that clearly exist within British society, modern Southern Ireland's reluctance to Irish unity, the clear split in the North on the Irish question, and ultimately the inevitability of the breakup of the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson is now Prime Minister, a man who once described people of Islamic faith as looking like letterboxes. Much to the joy of many on the far right, to the horror of the cushy old centrists who thought their austerity policies could never breed such a monstrous political reality, and the sheer distaste and disbelief to those on the left who stand for everything he seeks to dismantle about modern Britain. There's echoes by many in the press that Boris is more like a fascist than a prime minister, with his prorogation of parliament and eagerness to snatch an election to prevent a no-deal Brexit being prevented. How could anyone sit back and say, not my problem? Well, here's the thing. They're not. Whether you're on the Boris left, the Lib Dems, horny for Remain, or the Corbyn left, people are out and they are loud. Almost 500,000 people registered to vote in the 8 days after Johnson indicated that he planned to call a snap election to thwart rebels within his own party who want to stop the UK leaving the EU without a deal. Nearly 1 million people marched for a people's vote in late March as the Brexit deadline doomed. And nearly 35% of the electorate voted for hard Brexit parties like Brexit or UKIP in May's European UK elections. People are more riled up now than ever in the UK and across the world The cushy centre that once breeded the idea that nothing ever changes is dying out, as politics hardens on both sides of the political ideology spectrum, which was once left and right, but is now four-cornered in the UK, left, right, remain, Brexit. In a time where pretty much no one agrees, how can we possibly say there's no need for politics? How can we possibly say it is really possible to be apolitical? Look closer at home. The effects of Brexit, the housing crisis, the beef crisis, a hard border, the fantasy of Irexit, and of course, Dublin bus. Everyone in their own silos is getting riled up by something. Whether it's the middle class, Sheila and George's losing their minds over Bus Connects and how it's going to ruin their front yard, they'll be voting for someone who promises to scrap the bus corridors off their road. And of course, they'll stick up perhaps a banner saying, "Want green, vote green," at the cost of Mary and John running their farm in Offaly, whose business model wouldn't stand up to the standard of Sheila and George. Again, more divide, more split views, more of a thirst for politics, more of a thirst for division. Sheila and George will, of course, vote for whoever agrees to join, support and legitimise their community group, communities not corridors, for they recognise that in Ireland, whether you're in a small village in Carlow or out in Stony Batter or Dunleary, it's the pothole issues that get people elected, just as much as it is the fact that people can't afford their own home. And that's where we really have the future of apoliticism being dead in the water. Because by God are our generation angry and frustrated. And plenty of reason of angry do we have. I've been on this campus today, all day, talking about this big orange t-shirt that I'm wearing. I look like a Power Ranger. It says, break the barriers. What barriers? The barriers to education. The fact that there's so many people that could have been in this room tonight that couldn't make it because they couldn't afford to come here. We pay the highest tuition fees in the EU27. Dublin is the most expensive city to rent in the EU27, according to research by Nevin. And funding to higher education institutions has been slashed and not restored since the crash. Young people are suffering as the standards within our HEIs fall. This very institution is no longer in the top 100 list. Last year alone even, it fell from 120 to 164. Lecturers, in some cases on precarious contracts, are sleeping in their cars. Waiting lists for support have never been so long. And just the general reality is that people are downright being crushed. Up the road today, I attended a demonstration about workers receiving their tips in the Ivy. The lads on Dawson Street don't think its workers should be paid a living wage, and also have introduced a voluntary service charge of 12%, which many would be forgiven for thinking goes to its workers, but it doesn't. It goes directly to the employer. For those of you listening tonight, if you feel comfortable dining in the Ivy, and you like the service, pay the tip in cash. Young people are downright peed off. They know every day that being part of the millennial or Generation Z generation means they'll not only live less than their parents, but they'll also have less enjoyable and secure lives. The reality is we'll never own homes till we're well on the way to 40. So it's no wonder young people are becoming politically active in all sorts of ways. Left-wing groups on campuses, political parties are all growing in terms of their youth membership. Young people registered and enabled into the political system by referenda like repeal and marriage equality and recent presidential elections are using their vote to vote for progressive changes in their society. They are, and we are, the generation to follow the ones who thought nothing could change, whereas we are the ones left with such dire realities that not only must things change, but that via popular movements they can change. 2,159,655 people turned out to vote in the referendum to repeal the Eighth. Yes, it was a culmination of decades of campaigning, and yes, it was built on personal stories, but in this country, with our written constitution that we are so lucky to have, these things can only be changed when they're decided by popular vote and by mass movements. There still may be some of you who think, I still don't care. I don't need politics. Politics doesn't concern me in my everyday life. Well, here we go. Do you pay taxes? Political decision. Some libertarians would see it that if you never pay taxes, but then who will pay the guards to chase down your stolen iPhone? Those on the left would perhaps want your taxes to go up so they can pay for schools, bridges, infrastructure. Political decision. The libertarians would just want to wipe out your taxes. Ultimately, To be apolitical is to accept the reality of powerlessness. It is to literally say, I do not care. And humans have emotions, regardless of how empty some of us may claim to be, we care. But say you were to be political in today's society. Though it impossible, what's the good in that? Who would that help? Many have said that Putin's view in Russia is that people can do pretty much whatever they want in terms of offshore accounts and anything really, once they stay out of politics. Apoliticism is dangerous. It really is. To say you're apolitical is to literally say you're okay with anything. And that's just not possible. Our entire world is increasingly shaped by exterior factors and realities like the ones I laid out earlier. So yes, you can be powerless as the situation you've been put in, but this doesn't mean you are apolitical. Apolitical, for all its fancy jargon and academic points that some of the other side may wish to argue tonight, is ultimately dangerous. If our society was to turn entirely apolitical and just not care about politics, our society would crumble. Politics and democracy fail us every day in many ways, but without them, we'd be far worse off. Without participation, democracy crumbles. Without democracy, so does society. So I say today, if you are in your head somewhat apolitical, though it is truly impossible to be entirely apolitical, then realise whether you like it or not, you have an opinion, you do care about things, do some reading and participate. It's a right, and it's not something that just fell out of the sky. So stop pretending, stop trying to be edgy and distant from politics. Whether you like it or not, you're just as part of politics as anyone. You'll never escape it, so you may as well play the part while you can.
I'd like to thank Craig for their fine speech and call upon Matt and Lars to continue the case of the opposition.
The world is burning. The bastions of Western democracy have run out of feet to shoot themselves in and are now lying on the ground screaming. How can we vote for any of these people? How can we not vote for any of these people? Here's what I'm going to do in this speech. Given that I am the fourth speaker and about to offer you your fourth of 8 slightly modified definitions of the term apolitical of the night, I am going to give you what will hopefully be a brief explanation of what I am taking politics to mean. I'm going to justify to you why this is the debate I think is worth having, that I've chosen this definition not because I think it is the one most likely to win the argument, but because it is the definition that raises the questions I think we should be trying to answer. The thing about this debate is that it is inevitably a definitions game. I pay a lot of attention to definitions because I'm an incredibly pedantic person and also a math student, and they're not unrelated. Whether it is possible to be apolitical depends entirely on what it means to be apolitical, and the proposition knows this as much as the opposition knows this. The proposition has won no great victory when they stand up here to tell you that you cannot be apolitical because everything is political, when they claim that not caring about politics is political, and a morally reprehensible act at that. And when they state that to be a political being is to be a social being, and therefore to be a social being is to be a political being. Just because it is morally bad to be apolitical does not mean that it's not possible. Aristotle tells us that man is a political being. Thanks, Ashley. What Aristotle is saying in this section of politics is that man, or if this century, you can just say people, man is naturally predisposed to form city-states and social groups. And Aristotle goes on to say, quote, he alone has perception of good and bad and right and wrong and the other moral qualities, and it's partnership in these things that makes a household and a city-state, end quote. There are 2 things I want to take from this idea. Firstly, that politics is driven by a concept of how things should be rather than of how things are. This is how Aristotle distinguishes the political animal from the social. He describes this as a perception of good and bad, but given that being so moralistic is quite out of fashion these days, I think this is better described as an ability to make normative statements about what should be valued within society, what principles we should be operating on, and how decisions should be made. These are unquestionably political stances. Secondly, the idea that politics is inherent to the city-state. I think, as the proposition Jack said something that I've written down, in fact, which is that any system of relations of power is a political one, and any interaction which involves power is a political interaction, including Jack giving himself a speaking spot in this debate. I think it's not useful to say that politics applies to any power structure. I think that the reason this is actually lies in what Aristotle is telling us about the city-state, which is that when people are living in close proximity, when there are different functions being served by different people, and people are not self-sufficient, when people depend on one another, this is when a need for politics arises. Like recent polling data has shown that there's a massive ideological split between Democrats and Republicans on where they think the ideal place to live is. Democrats would prefer to be in an urban area where the government provides public transport and services and things within walking distance. Republicans would like to have their space. They like to live in big estates with gardens and drive their cars to the nearest supermarket. And this is not just a correlation of living in one area makes you gives you one political leaning or another. This is also an idea. This is also something about belief. Is that this is what these people consider the ideal situation. When politics takes place primarily in the domain of the city-state, it's taking place in a domain where people are dependent on one another and dependent on the state. And politics, I think, is about the state. It is personal insofar as the state and the governance of the state impacts our personal lives. But I think, in fact, Jack giving himself a spot in this debate is not necessarily a political interaction. It is just Jack deciding he wants to speak in this debate. But I think the thing is, the idea that to be apolitical is impossible is in itself a political idea and a normative one. I think one question that is brought up by this is there's a thought or a phrase coined in second wave feminism: the personal is political. I think not all social problems are inherently political. I think the personal is political to the extent that governmental interference affects your personal life. So in some situations, yes, abortion politics are politics because the government controls that aspect of our personal lives. There are other situations that the government has no influence on social matters, and therefore those matters are not political. And to say that because they're not political means they don't matter, or that because they matter means they must inherently be political, I think is a fallacy. I think to be a true political system, you must be able to opt out. I think we lose some of that ability to opt out when we depend on one another, as we do in these city-states of modern politics that Aristotle talks about. I think otherwise what distinguishes the political animal? I think it is important to also be able to define an apolitical space. Not a space that necessarily doesn't care about politics in a sort of like juvenile apathetic way, but is consciously not political. Like, for instance, the Supreme Court in theory is an apolitical space. We know this is not true in the United States, but in the Supreme Court is not able to rule on things that are considered political. These are things that should be left to the will of the people. I think it's important for us to be able to define an apolitical space within our society. I also think that existence is not inherently political, and this clashes directly with what Jack said to us. Because what is political is public. I know there is, in some situations, personal is political, but when the personal becomes political, the personal becomes public. And I think it is a violation of people's humanity to say that just because you're a member of a minority, just because you're a woman, you are inherently political. Your existence is political, and that you are holding an opinion somehow by just existing. I think this is a violation of our humanity, our privacy. I think to force people's lives into public property is just inherently unfair, and also that it removes this element of autonomy and this idea that what distinguishes the political animal of people from social animals, which also form social groups, is this idea that we have autonomy over how those groups are organized and how they're run. I also think that to say that to be apolitical is a position of privilege is also not entirely true, because social economic status and political engagement are not correlated. And obviously, political engagement is dependent on engagement with the state versus having political opinions, and everyone can hold political opinions, but people can also hold opinions that are not political. Those opinions are still important. Does the problem to tell me that there is nothing that does not transcend politics, that there is nothing that we can believe in without it going through the state? Thank you. Part 2 of this.
I would like to thank Matt for their very fine speech and call upon Olivia Brady to bourgeois opposition.
There's been a lot of talk about just general apoliticism, but I want to focus on the individual and how it is impossible for an individual to be apolitical, especially in a democracy. And that's what I really want to focus on, is the specifics of a democracy. I think it is impossible for any individual and should be it's ill-advised for any individual to be apolitical in a democracy. What I've understood apolitical to mean is a disinterest in politics and a general distancing from the political sphere, whatever that might be, for whatever reason that may be. So for democracy to work, every individual has to be engaged, and that's just a given with what democracy is. For people need to care, and it's impossible for democracy to function properly if each individual isn't taking their due role in democracy. So that is why I believe it is impossible to be apolitical, and especially in a democracy, which is what we are living in, which is what I think we should focus on in this debate. One cannot hold another to account if one does not take an interest in it, and holding someone to account is the most important aspect of a democracy. It is the people exercising power over the government, over those in power, the elites. No, thank you. So if individuals do not take an interest in that, democracy cannot function properly. So democracy, by basic definition, is government by the people, where rule is vested in the majority and exercised directly or indirectly through open elections or referendums, etc., etc. Democracy therefore fails if even one individual is apolitical, and that will become apparent later on in my speech. So I'd actually like to quote Hannah Arendt, who, for a bit of background on who she is, for those of you who may not know who she is. She was a German-American political theorist and philosopher who watched Germany be usurped by the Nazis during the 1930s. And she was researching anti-Semitism, which was illegal at the time, and put in prison for 8 days or 9 days. And she fled to Paris with her mother in the early 30s. And she is important to consider in this discussion, not both because of her interesting background, but because she's one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. And I think it's important to consider people who are qualified in this area, which is why I'm using her to make my case as well, because she has a lot more expertise than I do. So she equates apoliticism to apathy, and I think that's really important. And there is a quote which I'll read for her from one of her first works, was The Origins of Totalitarianism. So she says, it was characteristic of the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany and of the communist movements in Europe after 1930 that they recruited their members from the mass of apparently indifferent people who were rejected by other parties for being too apathetic, too indifferent. And that's very, very dangerous for a democracy. No, thank you. And I believe in our current day, we are inches from the edge of democracy, and it's important to engage every individual, as I said, in politics. We simply cannot afford to be apolitical. As has been mentioned last week and by other speakers here, the climate depends on politics, our livelihoods depend on politics, our education depends on politics, everything is dependent on what is going on in politics, so no thank you. It is of vital importance that we engage every individual, otherwise they fall into the clutches of those totalitarian regimes, the totalitarian movements as they start out, rather. So, in order to maintain a democracy, it is impossible to be apolitical. And of course, it may be argued why the end of democracy might be a bad thing. You know, democracy has several flaws. It's certainly not a perfect system. But of course, it would be a bad thing because the system set up by democracy itself allows for totalitarian movements to usurp the minds of those who are apathetic and apolitical and take them on board into their movement and to use their power collectively to get into power and to destroy the democracy. No, thank you. So, as mentioned with the Nazis and communists, they exploit the apathy in order to get into power, and that is why I believe it is highly likely that if even one individual is apolitical, that it leads to totalitarianism. So as I defined earlier, apolitical means to not have an interest in politics, and these people are targeted by parties such as the Nazis, and they plant ideological seeds in their heads, so put simply, that all Jews are evil and that they must be dealt with in the most extreme manner possible. And because that is so linked to their emotional and impulses, that seed develops in their head and enrages, and because it is so extreme and linked to the emotions, it makes people angry, and it makes a majority angry whenever a majority is formed. So that is why it leads to apoliticism really leads to the population, or a particular part of the population, no longer being able to rationalize or think about, understand why they have that opinion or how they got it, which is scary and dangerous in terms of democracy. It just simply cannot happen in a democracy. It leads to totalitarianism and is against all of the Enlightenment ideals that came to be and were used to base democracy upon. Arendt then goes on to say that the totalitarian movements aim at and succeeded in organizing masses, which she clarifies as not citizens with opinions about or interest in the state of the handling of public affairs. And this is important previously, as I mentioned, because regarding the strategies, these totalitarian movements organize and they activate the masses, and they get people moving and thinking more than those who are thinking for themselves. So that is why it is impossible to have even just one individual, which it may be argued, okay, it's just one person, like that won't have an effect on politics, but it does. One person turns into two people, and so on and so on. So you have a cohesive majority which takes power and destroys the democracy that you have. That's what happened in Germany, and that is what happened in other countries, and that's what will happen again if we don't engage everybody in politics, because it is so important. If we are to maintain democracy, we cannot have apoliticism in a democracy. It's impossible to be apolitical. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Olivia for their fine speech. Call upon Ronan Boyce to take the case.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members of the proposition, my fellow members of the opposition. Ronan Boyce is my name, and I have every faith that it is possible for every one of us, for at least a moment in our brief stint in this world, to be apolitical. If politics is the theory or practice of group conciliation to avoid conflict over a scarce resource, then being apolitical, as the proposition have pointed out, is antipathy towards this kind of thing. Not an action, but a display of apathy. Politics is the doing, apolitics is the undoing, the unthinking part of one's existence. Across one's lifespan, the engagement of the political brain, I will concede the proposition, is unquestionably unavoidable. However, it is not an omnipresent requirement. Our quotidian decisions are dominated by concerns for ourselves, not the group. And our quotidian interpersonal interactions are, for the most part, anodyne and non-conflictual. These are the possibilities to be apolitical of which we can avail from day to day. The motion before the House this evening is not that it is impossible for one person to be wholly apolitical for the duration of their lifespan. It is that it is impossible to be apolitical, full stop. The onus falls upon the proposition to establish for the House that the opportunity would never arise, not for a moment and for no one at all. This is an extraordinary allegation to make. My friends, think of all the spontaneous occurrences of order among uncoerced people, ones which did not require an active conciliation of parties, where there was no conflict over a scarce resource in the first place. If the House will indulge me, I will elaborate upon my point with an anecdote. Last week at some stage I took the Lewis home at lunchtime. I live in southeast Dublin, in case anyone didn't realise. And it was sparsely populated, usually, with the kind of septuagenarians and free travel and the Brown Thomas housewives that you kind of expect at that time of the day. And so there were more than enough seats for a few people on board. There was no discourse required to allocate the seats to those whom the group thought were most deserving, or to come together to socially define a concept of fairness on which to base that judgment. There was no danger of violence if we failed to amicably conclude the discourse. We simply sat down and order presented itself. Indeed, the half-empty, the midday Lewis is the placid bastion of the apolitical. Certainly an opportunity to avoid politics if one so chooses, at least in the time until it takes to get back to the suburbs. Furthermore, my friends, to be political, to decide on how best the group may conciliate itself, is necessarily an engagement of the second system of one's brain, the reflective capacity of our mind. However, for the most part, all humans fly through the motions of life on the ironclad wings of inertia, the system one part of the brain, without engaging the aforementioned reflective capabilities. In most of our comings and goings, from the way we walk and talk, to the manner in which we work, most of human action is automatic response to circumstance, not a product of active thought. It follows, my friends, that apolitics is not just a possibility, but the default position of being human. For the most part, we do not think, we just do. And politics is always thinking. If I may be cynical for a moment, if I wasn't already. Politics is the practice of gaining status or position in an organization, largely as a consequence of what one says and who one knows, rather than what one can do. It's the business of gaining power without merit. I think it's apparent to most people that our hyper-rationalized post-industrial economy provides us with plenty of possibilities if we're willing to take them. To ascend the dominance hierarchy in many organizations, public and private, based on the tangible value which we add, rather than the people, or rather than things we can promise or the strength of our contacts. The animal spirits of the free market have no penchant or patience for the political pursuit of status. They are driven by the atavist pursuit of growth. This is impersonal. This is apolitical. The proposition has chosen to beat the definition of politics, the golden word of this evening's discourse, to an airy thinness and spread it liberally across the entirety of human action and thought, like some linguistic St. Bridget's cloak. That's a reference just for the Catholics. Anyway, so that they may follow with a facile observation along the lines of, well, everything is political, so everyone is political, and there's no escape, and there's no agency whatsoever. This, the 250th session of the College Historical Society, is an intellectual and exacting body, not an imprecise rabble. It's not the Phil. Or Polsoc. Shame. Exactly, yes, I concur, Harry. I beg of this body to disregard such trite observations as a little more than assertion, but a lot less than argument. For politics to mean anything at all, it must be precisely defined by strict boundaries. At best, it is the most civilized of interpersonal interactions, the peaceful discourse which extinguishes or prevents intergroup violence in the face of resource conflict. And at least it is the theorizing on how best the former should be done. Politics occupies a finite segment on the spectrum of human action, not all of it. To conclude, we become political when we choose to engage our minds, not when we are mindless. Furthermore, we need only become political when we must actively seek conciliation with others, when the circumstances do not present us with automatic order. The rest of life's motions and commotions present themselves as the possibilities to be apolitical. All of the people cannot insulate themselves from politics all of the time, but at any given time, the possibility to be apolitical presents itself to a great many people. Anyway, I think I've made my